It was both utility and then fabulous glam. It was masculine and feminine. It was old and new.
In a significant legal setback for Blake Lively, the court ruled that she must turn over her private text messages with Taylor Swift.
And has a strong sense of self, also lose themselves and not realize that they're losing themselves.
Messages that directly relate to the production of It Ends With Us and to the broader legal claims surrounding her lawsuit involving Justin Baldoni and the Wayfair parties.
She's contradictions, but also you see how they make sense together, and she's trying to reconcile her past. Well,
this ruling didn't come out of nowhere. The judge made it clear that Blake herself had made Taylor a relevant figure in the case by explicitly naming her in initial disclosures as someone who had knowledge of complaints or discussions about the working conditions on the film set.
You gotta really be in your skin to dress like that. You gotta know who you are and have a strong sense of self.
In other words, Blake's own statements to the court opened the door to this type of discovery. Despite this, Blake attempted to resist the request by filing a motion for a protective order, arguing that the only reason Wayfair wanted the communications was to generate publicity and feed a media narrative.
And has a strong sense of self, also lose themselves and not realize that they're losing themselves.
However, the judge forcefully rejected this defense, calling her arguments unavailing and stating that under the federal rules of civil procedure, discovery is permitted for any non-privileged matter relevant to the case, regardless of any media attention it might attract. The court emphasized that just because something becomes a topic of public interest doesn't strip it of its legal importance. The judge also scolded Blake for repeatedly accusing the opposing side of using the case for PR, stating that such accusations do not change her obligation to comply with discovery rules. Ultimately, the court found the request for messages between Lively and Swift to be not only valid but necessary, given Blake's own claims about Taylor's knowledge of the alleged harassment and retaliatory behavior on set. This ruling marked a critical turning point in the case, underscoring that Blake's attempts to control the narrative through the media will not override her legal responsibilities in court. Blake Lively's motion for a protective order was not only denied, but also sharply criticized by the judge, who made it clear that her arguments lacked legal merit. Lively had attempted to claim that Wayfair's request for her text messages with Taylor Swift was part of a broader PR campaign aimed at embarrassing her or generating clickbait headlines. She even went as far as to suggest that an anonymous insider had leaked information to the press, implying that the opposing parties had already received Taylor's communications and therefore had no legitimate reason to request them from her. But the judge was unmoved by this argument and plainly stated that the Wayfair parties had not received any communications between Lively and Swift. As a result, the request was not duplicative or irrelevant, as Lively had claimed. In fact, the judge emphasized that her logic was flawed. If no messages had been obtained, they couldn't possibly be redundant. And if Taylor had information Lively herself deemed relevant, those messages were fair game. The court also reiterated that celebrity status and concerns about media coverage do not override discovery obligations. Blake's repeated claim that the case was being turned into clickbait by Wayfair and Baldoni was directly called out as both exaggerated and unconvincing. The judge reminded all parties that discovery in federal litigation is broad by nature and aimed at uncovering the truth, not at catering to celebrity image management or public perception. Lively's repeated efforts to paint herself as a victim of a media smear campaign while simultaneously refusing to hand over materials she acknowledged were relevant led the court to conclude that her motion was not only legally insufficient but also seemed to deflect responsibility and obstruct the discovery process. The judge's ruling also addressed Blake Lively's ongoing narrative that Wayfair and Justin Baldoni were weaponizing the legal process for publicity. Throughout the case, Blake has consistently accused the opposing parties of using court filings and discovery demands as tools for media manipulation, branding their legal efforts as nothing more than clickbait. However, the judge pushed back hard on that argument, asserting that just because a legal request becomes public or is discussed in the media does not make it illegitimate. In fact, the judge went further by stating that legal motions can simultaneously serve a legitimate litigation purpose and be referenced in the press, but the presence of media coverage does not undermine their legal validity. This part of the ruling was a clear and direct rebuke of Blake's repeated attempts to deflect legal scrutiny by framing herself as a victim of a public relations assault. The court also addressed her complaint that the discovery process was being misused for drama, reiterating that her own actions, such as naming Taylor Swift as a witness and highlighting Swift's knowledge of the alleged harassment, were what made Swift's communications relevant in the first place. The judge essentially told Blake that she can't name someone as a key witness and then complain when the other side seeks to obtain communications with that person. Additionally, the protective order already in place was cited as sufficient to prevent any leaks or misuse of the materials, nullifying Blake's concerns that her private texts might be exploited. Overall, this section of the ruling underlined the judge's clear stance. Blake's PR-focused arguments were not persuasive, and her obligations under federal discovery rules remained fully intact, regardless of her status, celebrity friendships, or personal discomfort. In his ruling, the judge took deliberate care to explain that the discovery request submitted by the Wayfair parties, specifically the request for Blake Lively's communications with Taylor Swift, was not an invasion of privacy, nor was it a sweeping or excessive demand as Lively tried to portray. Instead, the judge made clear that the request was precisely and narrowly focused, limited only to communications that directly related to two specific subjects. 1. The film It Ends With Us, and 2. The current legal proceedings in which Blake alleges harassment and retaliation by Justin Baldoni and the Wayfair team. This wasn't about digging through years of unrelated personal conversations or about exploiting Taylor Swift's fame, as Lively alleged in court and in public statements. Rather, the court noted that Blake had herself claimed that Swift possessed first-hand knowledge of key events related to the case, particularly about the working environment on set and how she, Blake, had expressed her concerns during production. By making those claims and naming Taylor in her initial disclosures as a person with relevant knowledge, Blake essentially opened the door for those messages to be reviewed. The court reiterated that discovery under Rule 26 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure allows for broad but not limitless access to non-privileged information relevant to a party's claims or defenses. The judge found that these messages fell squarely within that legal framework, and that the request was both reasonable and proportional to the needs of the case. Blake's attempt to argue that the Wayfair team either didn't need the messages or already had them, based on a vague claim involving an unnamed insider, was swiftly dismantled. The judge clarified that no evidence had been produced yet showing that Wayfair received these communications, and therefore the request was neither duplicative nor unnecessary. Additionally, Blake's concern that the messages might be leaked or misused was also addressed and dismissed. The judge reminded both parties that a protective order was already in place, allowing sensitive materials to be designated as attorney's eyes only or confidential, preventing them from being publicly disclosed. This mechanism already safeguarded Blake's privacy and undermined her fears of media exploitation. Her argument that these discovery efforts were designed to serve a public relations campaign rather than the legal process was not only legally irrelevant but also unsupported by facts. The court underscored that just because something is discussed in the media or garners attention does not make it illegitimate in court. Ultimately, this portion of the ruling served as a strong message. No amount of public image management, celebrity status, or strategic press statements can substitute for actual compliance with the rules of civil litigation. Blake Lively, having identified Taylor Swift as a key witness, cannot now avoid scrutiny simply because the resulting discovery may be inconvenient, uncomfortable, or potentially embarrassing. The judge's thorough breakdown of this issue emphasized fairness, proportionality, and the importance of factual relevance, clearly reinforcing that legal obligations are not dictated by how a party feels about media coverage, but by the legal standards governing discovery in federal court. Following the judge's ruling, Blake Lively quickly turned to the media to spin the outcome in her favor, despite the fact that she had just suffered a major loss in court. Instead of acknowledging that her request for a protective order had been denied and that she was now required to produce messages with Taylor Swift, Blake's representatives issued a public statement to major outlets like TMZ and People, falsely framing the ruling as a victory. They focused solely on the fact that the judge denied Wayfair's separate motion to compel documents, leaving out the crucial detail that the denial was procedural, not substantive. According to the court, Wayfair's motion to compel early production was denied, not because Blake had a strong argument, but because she had already stated in filings that she would turn over the relevant documents, except for the Swift messages, by the discovery deadline of July 1st. Additionally, Wayfair hadn't yet complied fully with Blake's requests either, which meant the court had no basis to force her to expedite production. The judge emphasized that this wasn't a case of one side being right and the other wrong. It was simply about timing and mutual compliance. Yet Blake's team used the denial of the motion to compel to claim a misleading win in the court of public opinion. Her reps issued statements asserting that she had produced far more documents than the Wayfair parties combined, conveniently ignoring the fact that most of those documents reportedly came from sources like illegally accessed phones, an issue that remains controversial in itself. Blake's team also repeated the argument that Wayfair had no right to ask for Swift's communications because they claimed the Wayfair parties had already received everything they needed from Taylor. But the judge had already debunked that claim directly in his order, noting that Wayfair had not received any communications between Taylor and Blake, and thus their request remained valid and enforceable. In short, Blake's post-ruling media blitz appeared to be another attempt to control the public narrative, obscure the true meaning of the court's decision, and paint herself as the party being wrongfully targeted. However, the judge's order made it clear that her PR tactics do not override her legal obligations, and certainly do not negate the relevance of discovery she is now required to produce. Her strategy of issuing carefully worded statements while selectively omitting key facts may work in the press, but as the judge signaled, it holds no weight in the courtroom. This moment highlighted a clear disconnect between how Blake is trying to frame the case publicly versus how the court is actually handling it procedurally and legally. The judge's order also delivered a subtle but sharp reprimand to Blake Lively for repeatedly misrepresenting the legal process in public and trying to undermine the seriousness of the litigation. Throughout the case, Blake has pushed the narrative that the Wayfair parties, particularly Justin Baldoni, are misusing discovery to generate press coverage and unfairly drag Taylor Swift into a legal matter in which, she claims, Swift has no real involvement. However, the judge explicitly pushed back against this narrative, stating that just because a request becomes public or is discussed in the media, that does not invalidate its legitimacy. Even more significantly, the court reminded Lively that she was the one who made Swift relevant, not Baldoni or Wayfair. Blake had identified Swift in her disclosures as a witness with knowledge of the alleged harassment and toxic work environment on the film set. Once she did that, the other parties had every right to pursue discovery in that direction. The ruling made it clear that Blake can't now accuse them of exploiting Swift's fame for PR when she was the one who introduced Swift as a source of evidence. This contradiction undermines her credibility both in court and in the public eye. The judge addressed the notion that Wayfair had somehow waived their right to the requested messages based on vague, unattributed claims from an anonymous insider, and rejected it as both irrelevant and unsupported. Even if such an insider said the messages had already been obtained, that statement was not officially tied to Wayfair, and even if it were, it wouldn't serve as a valid waiver of their legal rights. The court also addressed another of Blake's repeated claims, that she's being unfairly targeted because of her celebrity and friendships. But the judge dismissed this as immaterial, stating that no one is exempt from discovery simply because of their fame or discomfort with public attention. He also reminded both parties that a protective order was already in place, giving them ample legal tools to safeguard sensitive materials from public release. Therefore, Lively's concern that the messages might be leaked or used for media fodder was already handled, and did not justify withholding communications. This part of the order served as a critical reminder that the court is focused on legal standards, not public sentiment. Blake's ongoing attempts to deflect legal scrutiny by accusing her opponents of having nefarious media motives were, in the judge's view, repetitive, exaggerated, and increasingly hollow. His language, while measured, was firm and suggested mounting frustration with Lively's insistence on portraying herself as a victim of PR warfare rather than a party engaged in serious litigation. In short, the ruling reminded Blake that the courtroom is not a stage for public relations battles, and her efforts to shift focus away from the actual facts of the case would not shield her from the legal obligations she created through her own filings. A major theme throughout this portion of the video is the argument that Blake Lively is actively projecting and deflecting blame onto others, particularly Justin Baldoni, while attempting to distance herself from the consequences of her own actions. The video's creator highlights how Blake's legal and public relations strategies appear to mirror one another, both aimed at casting herself as a victim while painting Baldoni and the Wayfair parties as manipulative aggressors. However, the judge's ruling made it clear that these tactics hold no weight in court. For instance, Blake has continuously argued that the requests for communications, especially those involving Taylor Swift, are being used to fuel a media narrative. Yet the judge responded that just because discovery materials are of public interest does not invalidate their legal necessity, nor does it relieve her from complying with them. Moreover, the video underscores a pattern in Blake's behavior. She allegedly accuses others of doing exactly what she herself is doing. She's accused Baldoni and Wayfair of waging a smear campaign and exploiting Swift, yet she was the one who identified Swift as a knowledgeable witness. Similarly, while claiming to be unfairly targeted by PR tactics, Blake has actively engaged in her own media campaign, issuing statements to TMZ, People, and other outlets immediately after court rulings, often spinning the outcomes to favor her image while ignoring or twisting key legal facts. This is especially evident in her post-ruling response, which entirely sidestepped the judge's reasoning for denying the protective order and instead focused on claiming that Wayfair had already gotten what they needed, despite the court confirming that no such communications between her and Swift had been received. The video draws a parallel between these behaviors and classic deflection, accusing others of misconduct while quietly engaging in similar or more deceptive tactics behind the scenes. In doing so, Blake not only appears disingenuous but also undermines her own case, as her credibility continues to erode under judicial scrutiny. The judge's ruling made it abundantly clear that filing legal motions and then misrepresenting their implications in the press does not excuse a party from discovery obligations, especially when they've voluntarily made another high-profile individual, Swift, a central part of their own legal arguments. This part of the court's response and the video's analysis of it reinforces that Blake's narrative is collapsing under the weight of its contradictions and that the court is no longer indulging her media-driven attempts to control how the case is perceived outside the courtroom. The judge also directly addressed one of Blake Lively's central arguments, that the only reason the Wayfair parties were requesting her communications with Taylor Swift was for publicity, not for legitimate legal purposes. This claim, which she repeated both in court and in public statements, was flatly rejected by the judge. He ruled that the motivation behind a discovery request, whether or not it ends up discussed in the media, does not alter its relevance or legal validity. In fact, the judge noted that a motion or request can simultaneously serve as a legitimate litigation tool and be referenced in the court of public opinion without undermining its legal merit. He emphasized that the mere fact a request garners media attention does not make it invalid, and that Blake's repeated efforts to frame the legal process as a PR stunt were exaggerated and, frankly, unconvincing. Further, the judge made a clear distinction between anonymous public statements and formal legal positions. Blake had cited comments from unnamed insiders as proof that Wayfair already had the communications in question, but the judge pointed out that these types of hyperbolic and unattributed remarks are not considered reliable or binding in court. They do not amount to a waiver of discovery rights, nor do they prove that the evidence is irrelevant or already in the other party's possession. The court was clear. Blake's belief that the request for Swift's messages was exploitative is not grounds to deny discovery, especially when a protective order is already in place to shield sensitive information. This section of the ruling dismantled one of Lively's most persistent talking points, that the litigation is simply a weapon being used against her to create headlines. The judge was explicit. Blake Lively brought Taylor Swift into this case by stating that Swift had direct knowledge of the alleged misconduct, and now she cannot evade the resulting legal scrutiny. Her attempt to discredit the discovery process by labeling it a media ploy not only failed but was shown to be based on misdirection and selective interpretation of facts. The ruling served as a clear signal that the court would not be swayed by celebrity-driven narratives or efforts to blur the lines between legal accountability and public image management. One of the most striking points raised in the video is the contrast between Blake Lively's public response and the judge's actual ruling, which exposes how aggressively she is attempting to control the narrative outside the courtroom. Immediately after the ruling, Blake's team released statements that blatantly misrepresented what the judge had said, claiming victory, accusing the Wayfair parties of lying, and suggesting that the entire effort to obtain messages with Taylor Swift was nothing more than a publicity stunt. But as the judge emphasized in his order, Lively's arguments were not only exaggerated, they were legally unfounded. He called her use of unnamed insiders, speculation, and dramatic language hyperbolic, meaning exaggerated to the point of distortion. The court made it clear that generalized public statements, especially from anonymous sources, do not carry legal weight, and certainly do not excuse her from discovery obligations. Blake's strategy, as highlighted in the video, has been to present herself in the media as a wrong party, someone being unfairly dragged into a media circus over a legitimate legal matter. But what the court underscored is that her own behavior is a major reason for Taylor Swift's involvement in this case. She told the court that Swift had knowledge of alleged harassment and retaliation during the filming of It Ends With Us, and now she's claiming that the request for those communications is exploitative. The judge rejected this logic outright, making it clear that once she named Swift as a key witness, any communications related to the case or the production became fair game under federal discovery rules. Additionally, the court took issue with Blake's attempts to present legal procedures, like the motion to compel and the request for messages, as forms of media manipulation. The judge explained that a request for relevant documents remains valid even if it becomes part of public discourse, and that having celebrity status doesn't exempt someone from complying with discovery. In fact, the judge's ruling repeatedly emphasized that Lively's celebrity image does not shield her from the responsibilities she has under the law, especially when she is the one who introduced Swift as a potential witness. The video reinforces that Blake's continued media spin is doing her more harm than good, as it only strengthens the perception that she's trying to sidestep the judicial process by controlling public perception. Meanwhile, Justin Baldoni and the Wayfair parties have mostly remained silent, avoiding public comment and letting the court process play out. That contrast, the silence from the defendants versus the aggressive media tactics from Lively, only serves to underscore which side is focused on the legal fight and which is focused on public opinion. The judge's ruling essentially calls on Blake to stop treating the court like a stage for PR warfare and to start treating it like the legal forum that it is. The final portion of the video focuses on the broader implications of the judge's ruling, not just for Blake Lively, but also for Taylor Swift and the overall tone of the litigation. The video creator argues that Taylor's PR team, much like Blake's, has attempted to downplay her involvement in the case, portraying her as an innocent bystander being dragged into a scandal against her will. Public statements from Swift's camp have emphasized that she had no role in the film's casting, production, or editing. However, the judge's ruling, as well as past comments from Baldoni, contradict that narrative. Baldoni previously stated that Swift was present at key script meetings and even praised changes to the script, suggesting a deeper level of involvement than her team has publicly acknowledged. This inconsistency has led to the conclusion that Swift may not be the mastermind behind the legal mess, but she is certainly not as far removed as her team claims. The video also criticizes Swift's pattern of portraying herself as the perpetual victim whenever public controversy arises. It points out that Swift has distanced herself from Blake and Ryan Reynolds amid growing backlash, despite years of close friendship, public dedications, and personal gestures, such as naming Blake's children in her songs. The creator accuses Taylor of trying to rewrite the nature of her relationship with Lively to avoid negative publicity, despite having benefited from their close association for years. The takeaway is that distancing herself now appears insincere and opportunistic, especially as the legal pressure intensifies. Furthermore, the video urges Swift and her team to stop minimizing the lawsuit by calling it clickbait. This language, the creator argues, trivializes not only the seriousness of Blake's alleged misconduct, but also the trauma Baldoni says he experienced during production. By calling court filings clickbait, Swift's camp undermines the integrity of the judicial process and reinforces the perception that celebrities believe they're above legal accountability. In the end, the video calls for both Blake and Taylor to respect the legal process, comply with discovery obligations, and stop trying to manipulate public opinion as a way to dodge legal consequences. If Swift truly had no meaningful involvement, her communications will reflect that. But refusing to cooperate or dismissing the situation publicly only invites further scrutiny. The court has made clear that once someone is named as a witness in a federal case, they are subject to the same rules as everyone else, celebrity or not. The video closes by reiterating that truth will come out through the evidence, not through PR statements, and that both Lively and Swift need to stop acting like the rules don't apply to them.